And I'd love to just tell you a little bit about the campaign and then open the floor. This is really a historic moment, a completely unprecedented moment of converging crises that call for a really transformational solution based on democracy, justice, and human rights. And that won't be coming from political parties that are funded by predatory banks, fossil fuel giants, and war profiteers. We're told we're in a recovery, but in fact, for most Americans and most people around the world even, this is an emergency. We're losing good jobs, wages are declining, healthcare and housing costs are skyrocketing, an entire generation of young people is trapped in predatory student debt that they basically can't pay in the current economy. Black lives are on the firing line, immigrants are facing deportation, and we have these massive wars for oil for the past 14 years that are blowing back at us now with failed states, with growing terrorist threats, and with mass refugee migrations, and the climate is in a meltdown that threatens the very fabric of our civilization within our lifetimes. Meanwhile, the wealthy few are richer than ever, and the political establishment is actually making it worse with their policies of austerity and squandering trillions of dollars on wars, Wall Street bailouts, tax breaks for the wealthy. So the American people are in revolt. We know from polls that Democrats and Republicans are now rather small portions of the electorate, 29 and 21% respectively, according to the latest Wall Street Journal poll. 50% of Americans have basically rejected those two parties, which are running now majority unfavorable views by the American public. So people are really clamoring for something very different, and we are lifting that up and offering that. Specifically, we are calling for a Green New Deal to create 20 million jobs on an emergency basis, jobs that will green our energy, our food, and our transportation, and restore ecosystems. At the same time that this Green New Deal revives the economy, it also turns the tide on climate change, because we're calling for 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. And it also makes wars for oil obsolete. And I'll just mention, in addition, it pays for itself. The energy transition pays for itself simply in health savings from basically money saved from preventing the spectrum of diseases associated with fossil fuels. So this is a win-win. We're also calling as a major priority for canceling student debt, bailing out the students like we bailed out the banks. The students deserve relief from the consequences of the waste, fraud, and abuse on Wall Street, for which Wall Street got a $16 trillion bailout and counting. So it's about time to bail out our young people and bring them back into the fabric of society. 80% of young people stayed home in 2014. We intend to give young people a reason to come out and vote. And I'll mention we call for healthcare as a human right, for free public higher education, for reviving our schools, stopping this regimen of test, punish, and privatize that's been led by the Democratic White House and by Democratic partisans across the country. We call for a national action plan for racial justice now, and for basically calling a halt to police violence and racism, with police review boards, with standing investigators, so that all deaths at the hands of police or in police custody are investigated as a matter of routine. And we're calling for a halt to the immigrant deportations and detentions, which essentially criminalize the refugees from misguided US policies, including NAFTA, which has destroyed economies south of the border, the war on drugs, which has killed 100,000 people in Mexico alone, and people are fleeing violence from the drug wars, which is very much a US policy all over Latin America, and from the military and political illegal interventions, including coups and invasions in Latin America in particular. this is sort of a prototype that's also going on in the Middle East. And I'll just end by saying we also call for a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy. And specifically, you know, what is the answer to ISIS? Let me just say up front that the answer to ISIS is not doing more of what created ISIS. ISIS is part of the blowback from a failed foreign policy of total economic and military domination that has created 5 failed states, that has basically made terrorist threats far worse and created ISIS, in fact, which is widely acknowledged, and created mass refugee migrations. So we need a foreign policy based on international law and human rights. We need a weapons embargo to the Middle East instead of arming and funding either on behalf of the US or our allies, in particular the Saudis and the Qataris, who are arming and funding good terrorists and good warlords. We basically need a weapons embargo, and we need to halt the funding, even if that means seizing the bank accounts of our allies who have been funding terrorist forces for the last decade and more. So these are critical problems that everyday Americans are being really thrown under the bus over. $6 trillion spent on these wars for oil over the last decade and a half. $6 trillion, which comes out to $75,000 per household. So there are ways to move forward that doesn't dig us in deeper, that are based on principles of democracy and justice applied here in this country and applied around the world. These are solvable problems, and I'll just mention finally that as an independent third party, it's important to recognize independents are no longer the minority. We're basically half of American voters now that have rejected the Democratic and Republican parties, that have thrown them under the bus. And the positions that we're lifting up are supported by majorities in poll after poll. So the name of the game is getting word out. If young people alone who are in debt learn that they have a way to cancel debt by coming out and voting green in 2016, because we're the only campaign and the only party that will cancel student debt, if those 43 million young people come out to liberate themselves from debt, that alone is a plurality of the vote. It's enough to win the election. So when young people learn that there's a way for them not only to participate and be respected, but to actually take control of their future and be the dominating force in the election, we could see things turn in a really remarkable way. So we're saying it's time to stand up with a politics of courage, not a politics of fear, because that fear has delivered everything we were afraid of. All the reasons people were given to silence yourself and vote for the lesser evil, because you didn't want more Wall Street bailouts, you didn't want our jobs going overseas, you didn't want the attack on our civil liberties, on the freedom of the press, you didn't want the offshoring of our jobs, these corporate trade deals, the increase of this massive and unending war on terror. All those things we've gotten by the droves because we, as a public interest force, allowed ourselves to be silenced with this lesser evilism. So we say, forget the lesser evil, it's time to stand up and fight for the greater good, like our lives depend on it, because they do. We can have a world that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. That world is not in our hopes, it's not in our dreams, it's right here and now in our hands. Thank you. With that, I'll just open it up.
Hey, Jill. Locally, we just had a really beloved progressive talk radio host announce that he was quitting his show because he's in a feud with another beloved talk radio host. And what he cited was the acrimony between Democrats supporting Sanders and Democrats supporting Hillary Clinton. And can you speak to this phenomenon of like I'm saying, acrimony within a party to choose a presidential candidate?
I think there's a lot of acrimony out there in general these days. So just a word about that first, and then about inside the Democratic Party. I think people are walking around kind of tiptoeing on a minefield right now, not knowing which one's going to explode next. And I think there's just general anxiety, fear, and there's a real lack of trust, because who do you trust out there? You know, we've been betrayed by so many of our institutions. Government, so much of the press has been corporatized. You know, the Supreme Court is certainly in the pocket. As money and power have concentrated in the hands of very few, you know, all the institutions that used to support our sense of democracy and community are really crumbling before our eyes. And this, to me, is why we really need transformative change. And that change needs to be really based on our moral compass, on our deeply held beliefs of democracy, justice, and human rights. We don't have that in our conventional political parties right now, so there's incredible infighting and bitterness within them. You know, and specifically within the Democratic Party, I think people are very afraid of being betrayed, and perhaps the bigger trend is that people are leaving the Democratic Party. According to polls, people are fleeing the Democratic Party because they don't trust what's going on there. And I think we're seeing that that kind of social chaos inside the Democratic Party as well. And it doesn't, you know, it doesn't surprise me, because the Democratic Party does not have, it's not known for its moral compass, you know. And so much hope and faith in change was put into the last election and the one before that, and people's hopes were dashed. So I think there's a lot of anxiety within the Democratic Party right now. And, you know, I sort of, I feel like these days what we do as an independent, people-powered party is we act as political therapists, and we say there is a way forward, you know, that's based on principles that really reflect our deeply held values, rather than compromising, you know, with a party that's funded ultimately by some of the biggest political predators out there. And I mean, you know, corporate predators. So it's very unfortunate, and I hope people in their dismay over the Democratic Party will consider their options outside of politics as usual. And I hope they don't quit their jobs in progressive media, because we don't have many voices and we badly need them.
Well, the
crimes. They have declared that their goal is to overthrow the federal government. What would you do if you were president?
Yeah, you know, you make a really good point. If these people had dark skin color, you know, there would be no hesitation about, you know, doing whatever it took to take back the facility, you know. And if they were of Islamic faith, you know, they would be in peril for their, you know, for the next breath that they took. So, you know, I think we need to stand firm using peaceful means if possible, and whether that means shutting down their electricity, their water, you know, their sanitation, etc. They're using all peaceful means to move them out and to address this broader issue, you know, of what's going on with these ranchers. And let me say there that I have a note of sympathy for people who are facing economic distress. And we're seeing that across working people and across middle class. We're seeing rising death rates with depression and with hopelessness. And, you know, this is sort of where fascism comes from. Fascism comes from, you know, people who have nowhere else to turn. So I think it's really important also to address the basic underlying driving issues, and I know that cattle ranchers are facing drought. You know, they're facing some very difficult economic issues, but we need to have a real discussion about that. And furthermore, you know, this is where our basic policy comes in. People need to be assured that they are going to have jobs. They're going to have jobs with living wages, and they have an assured economic future. So we need to pull the rug out from under these proto-fascist movements, which are springing up all over the place.
Speaking of jobs, there's a movement to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Local businesses are opposed to that. Do you think something like that would work, or would it be counterintuitive?
You know, if the minimum wage were adjusted for where it were in the 1960s, it would be well above $15 an hour. And if it were adjusted for the increasing productivity of workers, it would be, you know, in the 20-somethings, $22 an hour. So, you know, I think we have kind of made this deal with the devil, essentially. We have supported massive profits for the wealthy few, but we've told working people that they're not entitled, that that's entitled. There are indeed stresses on small ma and pa businesses, and we need to get them the supports that they need as well. Small businesses are in very bad shape. We need to be sure that they're not burdened with the cost of health care, which again should be paid for proportionally by those who afford it in a Medicare for All system that ensures everyone is covered in an efficient way. We need to ensure that small businesses have access to loans and the credit that they need, which they don't currently. So there are ways that we can support small businesses, but working people should not be the sacrificial lambs here. And let me say that the living wage needs to be nationalized. It should be a federal standard. Thank you. Very good. Any other?
Any considerations of running mates? Last time you ran with
Sherry Hungola.
Yeah.
Yes. Not yet. There's what should I say? There are many interested communities that would like to be more visible, seen and heard, and the purpose of our campaign, or one of its purposes, is to lift up the voices of disenfranchised communities, of frontline communities, to make frontline struggles the front lines of presidential dialogue. So we're particularly looking at frontline communities and people to speak for them.
I know there's other folks seeking the nomination. Do you have much contact with them? Is it a collaborative effort? Does it feel, I think Greens are much more about collaboration than necessarily competition. Is it a competitive thing? Are you in communication with those folks or coordinating in any way?
We have coordinated on a couple of joint appearances with the party. For the most part, we are very focused on getting our message out beyond sort of the inner circle. The other campaigns are, shall we say, more on the exploratory phase and not actually, on the road, not talking to voters more broadly, which is where our focus is right now. Thank you.
Sufficient. Do you have plans to come back to Oregon again?
What's that?
Do you have plans to come back to Oregon again?
We certainly hope so. And let me just say about Oregon, it has been so refreshing to see the triumph over fossil fuels going on in Portland, with so many facilities having been stopped before they poison the water and the air and the people. This propane facility that was going to be built in the harbor, I guess. These bring very real and present dangers. It's very exciting how these struggles have unified people in the communities where this stuff would be transported through, polluting it, putting it at danger for explosion and for coal dust and so on. And what's really exciting is seeing that Portland City Council actually came out, thanks to the leadership of the grassroots community, that the City Council took a stand opposing any further fossil fuel infrastructure. And that is likewise a plan that we have called for at the national level. We do have an emergency. When Pearl Harbor was bombed after the Second World War, it took us 6 months to convert the economy to 25% of GDP within 6 months. It's absolutely astounding. 25% of GDP was converted to a wartime footing to deal with the national emergency. What we have in front of us now is a national emergency that makes Pearl Harbor look like peanuts, because we're looking within decades, according to the latest science, we're looking at the potential for the breakup of the Greenland ice sheet and potentially the West Antarctic ice sheet as well, which would profoundly raise sea level by 10, 20, even more feet in a tsunami-like effect. You're not talking about gradual rise. This is as an ice sheet breaks up and tumbles into the ocean, you see a massive rise in sea level. So we're talking about not wiping out one harbor, we're talking about wiping out all harbors all around the world at the same time, and these are major population centers which are living on the coast around the world. So this is not something we are going to survive. We need to declare a national emergency right now while we can solve it, especially when we have a solution that not only solves the climate crisis, it actually improves our economy. It creates a sustainable, just, living wage, green economy that is within our reach right now. So, you know, we're saying we can do this, we need to get the word out, we need to mobilize. In many ways, this is sort of a Hail Mary moment right now. On the climate, you could say on the economy as well, which is, again, teetering on the brink, perhaps an even bigger brink than the last crash of 2008. The banks are only bigger and equally leveraged, shall we say, and equally invested in reckless gambling that taxpayers and savers actually are now on the line for, because now not only do they have bailouts, now they have a thing called the bail-in, which is basically where when the bank goes bankrupt, they can confiscate the savings that are either stored in the bank or the money that's moving through them overnight through your pension funds and municipal savings and things like that. So there are all kinds of ways that the economy is seriously at risk now because it is still being manhandled by predatory banks and the like. You know, we need a democracy revolution. We need it right now. That won't happen with one person. It really requires a coalition of us, a coalition for justice, for human rights, for democracy, a coalition that coheres over time, space, issues, and generations. By definition, that is a political party. We need a new political party which is not held hostage by the economic and political elite that are driving us over the cliff right now. So we're saying it's time to stand up with politics of courage. The most dangerous thing you can do right now is to continue to vote for what has been absolutely put us on a lethal trajectory. We need to stand up and assert the power of our democracy. And by getting ourselves into the debate, by being covered, by using social media, we can get the word out now to the demographics who self-organize, like young people in debt. That's a self-organizing demographic. Nobody's better positioned to get the word out. And getting that word out to young people alone, that they can be liberated from their debt and be assured of not only having health care as a human right, but access to higher education for free, and having jobs through a Green New Deal and the guarantee of a living wage job. Young people who realize that they have the power to actually make this happen by coming out and taking over the election, that could actually be the thing that sets a spark. And whether we win the White House or whether we simply get enough votes to win the day and change the agenda, we can propel these real solutions forward and build the momentum for that political revolution, which cannot stop at the primary and it cannot stop after the election. Whether we win the office or we win the day, this fight will go on, and it will go on in a party that supports this agenda. It will not be folded into a campaign that is inherently opposed or into a political party that is fundamentally at war with an agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit. Together, we're unstoppable, and we're going to make it happen. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out.
Can I get a picture of you guys with the candidate?
Yeah.
The greenie people?